Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Christine Charles. I am a field crops educator based out of the Kellogg Biological Station in Berry County, and we're going to get started here with virtual breakfast. Okay, what you guys have all been waiting for. So we'll have Scott Bales be sharing with us today. He is our MSU dry bean specialist, and he'll be talking about dry bean management, data-driven decisions. All right, Scott, take it away.
Thank you for that introduction, and I'll get screen share up here. But thanks for the introduction. Once again, my name is Scott Bales. I am our dry bean specialist here at Michigan State University, um, an academic specialist within a Department of Plant Soil Microbial Sciences. However, I am based out of a research facility here in Frankenmuth, the Saginaw Valley Research and Extension Center. And today, we're going to talk about, dry bean management. I think this is really timed appropriately here on May 29th of this year. With how warm things were early, I was a little nervous. We were going to kick things off in a bit of a bigger way, a little bit early this year with the holiday being early Memorial Day. But this cool wet end to May has definitely delayed things. But I'm sure as we'll hear from Jeff, things are about to change, and I think we're about to take off as far as planting goes. So a little bit of an introduction to the topic, right? For those of you listening, I do have a graph up now that has the cost of production of dry beans on our first y-axis over the years of 2020 through 2024. This is an estimate, we put together with our farm business management team, something that we really thought, was an accurate representation of the average farm in Michigan, right? Take that for what it's worth. Everybody's farm is different. Every farm is a fingerprint. You hear me say that a few times today. Some are higher, some are lower, but this is what we wanted to represent as an estimate. And back in 2020, that estimate was about $650 an acre. And if we simply adjust that for the inflation over the past 4 years, we're approaching $800 an acre for the production of dry beans with fixed and variable costs. And you guys know that, much better than we do, and everybody, can look at their own balance sheet and understand where they sit. But the second line we have here is our price received. So this is USDA data. Price received, in dollars per hundredweight, over that same time frame. And really the interesting note here to me is, if you look at the slopes of those lines, right? Our price received, went up at a higher rate, than our estimated increase in cost production over that time, right? So that really helped protect our margins in dry bean production, and really made them an attractive option for us the past few years. However, those markets did soften a little bit, and those margins are predicted to come back tighter again. And I'm not a marketing expert, nor an economist, so I will not make estimates on what this will look like in 2025. But I think most folks can agree, that it's going to be a little tighter than it has been the past few years. So that's really kind of the intro to today's discussion, is how can we protect that margin, profitably raise dry beans, and also make sound agronomic decisions, based on the data that we have available. So I kind of broke that into three categories, early, mid-season, and harvest, with some subcategories, underneath of those. For the early stages, we'll just talk very briefly on these topics and mostly where you can find more information if you have questions still about how you want to manage your dry beans this year, what changes you might want to make. I'm hoping everybody has a plan in place, but if you really want to drill down on some of those questions here at the end, I want to be able to provide those resources for you guys and what's out there. So we'll talk real briefly about nutrient management. Planting of dry beans, mostly when should we go, which the weather's kind of answering those questions for us as we speak. Early season weed control, as then we move into the middle part of the season, we'll talk about weed control again as we get into post-emergent applications and also disease management, one of our bigger topics in dry edible beans. And then towards harvest, overall desiccation strategies, and things we can do to help preserve quality, which eventually preserves our margin and our profit structure too. So, just touching on nutrient management, I've been getting a lot of questions about this, just the past couple of weeks, right? Of, what do we need? What do we not need? Where can we trim some of these costs? And when I talk about nitrogen, our base recommendation for many years has been 40 to 60 pounds of actual nitrogen applied per acre. And we've done work, with Kurt Steinke in his lab, over the past couple of years, and that still is a really solid recommendation for us. Typically, we're going to expect a 1 to 3 bag type yield advantage, from adding nitrogen from no nitrogen applied at all. Which some folks are surprised that it's as small of a difference as that is. But once again, if we look at, economics and cost of nitrogen, per pound, and also the price of beans, per bag, that's something that we really have wanted to do and also can help, protect some yield, when we go into inclement weather. Dry beans are legumes and they are able to fix nitrogen, but they're just not really efficient in it. So that's why we do see that bump. But on that note, I will say that we really need to make sure that we're utilizing our nitrogen credits. If we have heavy manure usage in the rotation, if we have legume cover crops ahead of it, if we're plowing down alfalfa and seeding beans, we really need to pay attention to that because a little bit goes a long ways when it comes to nitrogen, and we do not, see added economic or agronomic benefits, when we get those really high rates of N out there. And that same kind of merit will go for our, other macros, P, K, and sulfur. A lot of times phosphorus is only responsive when our soil tests are low, and the same thing will go for potassium. So if we've been doing a really good job, maintaining our soil test levels, we're in those maintenance range, and we choose to draw from the bank a little bit, for our dry bean crop. That's something we're certainly okay with, and we will generally not see a real substantial yield increase, if we do choose to add, P and K. Not saying it's not a bad idea, to have a well-rounded starter or something like that, which we'll get into what those rates look like. But generally, we're not going to see a yield benefit this year from that. And same thing with sulfur. A lot of guys, do include some thiazole in that starter, and once again, that's not a bad idea to keep it in your rotation because we do know we need it. But rarely do we see that in the balance sheet, in the 2025 growing season. The two that I do find a little more important, similar to nitrogen, would be some of our micronutrients, like zinc and manganese. Zinc, often we're deficient on our high pH soils. We can also run into an issue after sugar beets, with some of that zinc, being tied up. And manganese, we often do see a deficiency there too. So that is something that's really important, to make sure we're considering. And band applications are often the most efficient, for those applications. But really, the merit of dry beans, they're low nutrient users. So if we're doing a good job managing our rotation, that's really where we should spend a lot of our time, when it comes to, fertility and nutrient management in dry beans. Dr. Kurt Steinke's lab has a lot of great resources out there. If you guys go to his website, MSU Soil Fertility Research, and also the bulletin that does have dry beans included is the nutrient recommendations for field crops in Michigan. That's E2904. Has some great information, on recommended rates and also crop removal for dry edible beans in Michigan. And another lesson from Kurt, that I've learned is his kind of motto, start right to finish well. And the graph I put up here that I'll explain for those of you who are just, listening as well, is we have percent of maximum uptake, that I adapted from a group out in Canada, Hurd and Brawley, um, across dry bean growth, by our stages, and they have, V4, R1, and R7. I added just kind of a time frame of when we would expect that. V4, you're looking about 30 days after planting. Flowering, 46 to 50. R7, 72 to 75 days generally. And then harvest, we're predicting about 100 days after planting, given a normal growing season. But you can see how rapid the uptake is, of NP, K, and S. And also we have biomass planted in there. So, in that 46 to 72 days, the slope of that line is really steep. So when it comes to, nutrient management in dry beans, it's not a crop that we want to be playing catch up with. We want to make sure that from the day that planter, pulls out of the field, that that crop has everything it needs, to be brought to harvest, in the most efficient way possible. And then the last thing I'll touch on in nutrient management, is crop removal. For an average yield goal, of 22 bags per acre, which is our a roundabout rolling state average for production. Some guys will say, well, my average is higher than that. Well, and that's okay. We can make those adjustments, on a per bag basis. But the main takeaway I wanted to have here was how low some of these crop removal numbers are, right? In nitrogen, we don't want to focus a ton on, right? Because it's a legume. We know we supplement nitrogen, but we're not responsible for providing that whole 72 pounds. Phosphorus, we're looking at 28 pounds, with a 22 bag crop, removed from that field. Potassium, 44, and then sulfur, only 5 pounds per acre. So that's just something to be conscious of. We're building those rotations, and looking at what this dry bean crop does need. So then we'll move on, into planting. One of my kind of pet peeves the past couple of years, especially when we've had these really dry springs, is recreational tillage. It didn't happen so much this year, but when we are dry early, guys get in the habit of wanting to kind of quote knock that bean ground down early, get it flattened out, get it nice, get it ready to go. But we can run into moisture issues there as well as wind and rain erosion when that ground is worked, 2, 3, 4 weeks ahead of dry bean planting, when it really doesn't need to be. Ideally, we like to see some type of cover crop on that, heading into the spring of dry beans. And I really like to see it covered, until at least May 15th, right? That's something that I think is a really sound recommendation for us in most years. And obviously that you have to play that by ear, right, with weather conditions, when you plan to plant, when and how you're going to terminate that crop. And, as we're kind of the goal of today is really to talk about, data and looking at your farm and what makes money and what doesn't. I'd really encourage you to look at, what it costs you to, terminate or keep that field clean from the start, and look at your alternative options, of herbicide costs versus fuel. And that's different for everybody, right? Do you own a sprayer? What products are you using? What are you using to do your field work? How fast can you get it done? What's your labor look like? But I think that's an important calculation for everybody to do. Because starting clean in dry beans is more important there than most of our other crops in the rotation. It's a sound piece of weed control advice, that Christy will give. But with non-GMO crops, that's really essential. And then the other thing to kind of think about, the earlier we knock that down, sometimes more likely we're going to need, 2 passes of tillage or 2 passes of burn down herbicide to ensure that we're starting clean, depending on when that starts. A lot of times, though, if we are seeding a cover crop in the fall, after beets or after corn, depending on what your rotation looks like, and if that's being incorporated with a high-speed disc, a lot of times that ground is pretty well fit, and we can get away with 1 pass of tillage, potentially a pass of burn down herbicide. But as we're rolling into planting, that pre-plant incorporated herbicide, something that's really not optional. We know it's an added cost and it's added time, but that's really the foundation, of weed control and dry beans, and something we want to make sure, that we're keeping in that plan for the year. Now's the $1 million question, when do we plant dry beans? And I pulled up another graph here. This is looking at soil temp at a 2-inch base, just here at the research farm in Frankenmuth for the month of May. A lot of guys were getting, kind of excited there towards the middle of the month. We had these really warm days, highs in the 80s. We had soil temps, that were above 65 degrees, which is my personal threshold we like to see, for true commercial bean planting. If we get to 65-degree soil temps, and I always add the caveat and rising or sustained at least, that's kind of my threshold for it's okay to plant, rather than really holding fast to a calendar date because we've been seeing those warmer soil temps earlier in the month. This year, we did see those, but we had that fall off, obviously, that we've had that we are recovering back out of. We are working on a data planning study, though, so it is yielding some interesting data here as we speak for some of these earlier planted beans. Our goal was to put in, 5 planting dates in the month of May. That didn't quite happen with rainfall, but we did get 3 in. So our earliest one there was on the 12th, and those are very slow coming out of the ground, right? We got these ones, germinated fast in those warm soil temps, but when we went cold there the past, 2 weeks, essentially, they virtually stopped. We did plant again, as we kind of came off of that cold front, with the idea that we might see a difference there, planting into warming soils versus planting into cooling soils. And it does appear we're going to have some slower emergence out of that, second planting date. And then we did just put in our third planting date just 2 days ago. And those are just, now swollen, not quite germinated yet, but I suspect by late today and into tomorrow, we'll see some movement out of those heading into the warmer season. These will be showcased at our field day, that we do have coming up in August, and we also will have 2 more planting dates in there before the season concludes. So as we kind of move into our mid-season, we'll talk, briefly on weed control, right? The biggest piece of advice I can give is be on time with the correct mix. Make sure that we're consulting the weed control guide, that MSU does put out, and make sure we're using our correct adjuvant packages, right? If we're using a herbicide, make sure, that we're doing the right things as far as AMS and COC, to make sure we're getting the most bang for our buck, out of the expensive part of those mix. Our chemistry bill in dry beans is not cheap. We don't want to shortchange ourselves, by not, throwing in the correct correct rates, correct amount of our adjuvants. If we are trying to manage pigweeds, though, we do need to make sure that we're including group 15. We've been seeing water hemp, much more widespread. That's something that we need to be managing between our, group 15s, our pre-emergent, or our group 14s, our PPOs, reflex for post-emergence management. And the biggest piece of advice I can give there too is if you have escapes, we need to make sure that we're getting these into the diagnostic lab to make sure that we know what resistance we are dealing with on these. The other, cheap addition we can make to that tank is making sure our carrier volumes are high. That really helps a lot of our dry bean products, based on our mode of action, that we're using. So really, we don't want to skimp, on carrier volume. Water is cheap, and it really helps us, in weed control. Two things I will kind of question that often get thrown in the tank, is foliar fertilizer, and insecticide if we haven't been scouting. Is there a documented ROI on either of those? It is really tough, to find one a lot of the times. Not saying there's not a fit for them, at times, but as a general rule, I think that's a good way we can save a few dollars per acre, on those post-emergence applications. And then, as we kind of wrap things up here, talking about disease management, we've talked a lot, about, the benefits of fungicide use. And really, that's something that if we have good beans, we have mold conditions, which generally we do in the thumb of Michigan, we really want to make sure we're considering a fungicide application, in flowering stages. We do have, some great information, out of the Michigan trials, that we run here, the Michigan Dry Bean Research Report, and also North Dakota State, does a lot of great work with Michael Wunsch's lab, comparing a lot of products to apples, and it's a great tool for us to look at. Anthracnose has been quite widespread the past few years. If you are having issues with this, please contact me so we can get those samples identified and also identified for what race of anthracnose we're dealing with, as there are multiple races and it does make a difference on what our genetic resistance or tolerance is. Moving into harvest, kind of the last phase for us here for the year. Our real goal here, especially in margin protection, right, is to deliver high quality, low FM samples. We want to make sure we're being paid for the highest percentage of beans that we are delivering. And two of the ways we can do that, if we're dealing with lamb's quarter or really heavy green stems, in market classes like small reds, we need to make sure that we have the appropriate tank mix for our desiccation. And if it's lamb's quarter or green stems, we probably need gramoxone, in the tank, with our sharpen application. But that's something that we really need to exercise patience on and make sure that we're applying at the right time. There's data from GoffNet and Sprig that early applications, can reduce yield by as much as 55%. And here's a picture of black beans that did have an application that was too early on, right? A, this is off label, and B, this is a surefire way to leave yield and dollars on the table by pulling the trigger a little bit too early. And then the last slide I have here, talking about quality, it's really something important that, quality is caused, not controlled, right? This is where we really need to make sure, that at the end of the year, we're monitoring for seed coat checking and splitting during all stages of physical handling, especially when harvest conditions go dry. Damage is cumulative on the way to the consumer. It starts with the grower. The elevator is responsible as well as, the processor or canner. But really, we want to make sure that we're doing the right things from the start, monitoring ground speed, cylinder speed, etc. And food safety within the supply chain really provides both those short-term, margin protection, as in, delivering your full price at delivery, but also long-term, as we maintain those relationships, with our customers, and Michigan maintains a source for high-quality dry beans. With that, I will wrap things up.
All right, so we'll open it up for questions now. Scott, you had a first question here on populations in 30-inch rows. Can you speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah, definitely. So our a lot of our base recommendations that you'll find published are for narrow rows, and by narrow, usually refer to 20 or 22s. And usually for black beans, and that would go for navies too, or small seeded beans. You're at 100 to 130, as your best, economical planting rate. When we do go to those 30-inch rows, though, we do pull those down a little bit and generally have that recommendation of about 90 to 100,000 seeds per acre. If somebody is interested in kidney beans, so as we go up in seed size too, we can pull generally about another 20% off of those. So it is a little bit of a complicated topic when we get into dry bean populations in general. For black beans in 30s, it's pretty straightforward, at 90 to 100,000. But if somebody is, looking at something a little different, we can always address that too.
And just a reminder, folks, you can put your questions in the chat here. Scott, you also put down the research report from 2024. What kind of things are you um, looking out for this year based on what we saw in the 2024 season? And then I'll get into the research report as well.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, as we head into 2024, we have quite a few exciting projects going on, at least in my opinion. Some things that are a little different than normal. Some of these things are very very long-term goals like variety development. That's a big part of my program. And that's a 10 to 20 year pipeline, right? So that's something we're always working on. But things that are different, that we've been addressing are the data planning trials. Moving those planning dates up. We're seeing those warm soil temps. We're seeing some beans that are a little more resilient to some of these colder soil temps and wet feet, as we might call it, those heavy rainfalls. So we've been working on that the past couple of years. Last year, that was really negatively impacted by some thunderstorms, real heavy rainfall, which is not good for dry bean stands early. This year, knock on wood, things are looking a little better, right? It was cold, but we haven't had that excessive rainfall. So some exciting data to come out of that. Other things we're working on would be strip tillage in dry beans. Working on that with Dr. Christy Sprague's group. Looking at cover crop integration, looking at, different tillage methods, trying to control erosion early season. We've all seen the dust bowl that we can have in June at times, across the thumb, as we work those PPIs in for dry beans when it's hot and it's dry and it's windy. So, looking at some alternative systems, just because we've always done it a certain way doesn't mean we always have to do it that way. So a little bit out of the box, but those are the two that I'm probably most excited about this year.
Great. Well, I can't wait to hear more about them. So I'm wondering, out of the seed treatment options, when you're thinking and weighing what inputs we need and what we don't, that first slide was really, powerful and sucker punched you in terms of thinking about what to shift. What kind of seed treatments are worth going after? Is it worth having the insurance this year? What have you been seeing?
Yeah, on the topic of seed treatments, a lot of times, that's something that we don't always have a lot of options in, right? Every source of seed origin is different, right? Whether they're doing the treating here, whether treating's being done out west before seed is shipped. So a lot of times, if we want something special, we would need to really request that ahead of time. And a lot of times, that's treated or not. And most of the time, due to the root rot pressure that we can have, a lot of that is coming treated with a fungicide. And with those fungicide mixes, we are also getting insecticide more times than not. And that is one that it is a complex topic when we try to look at, the ROI, of those seed treatments across acres. And something that's always interesting, especially as we have some new products and new blends, going on the seeds. Not a lot of change in active ingredient, but different proportions, different rates. Um, Everybody's searching for something to help with that early season root rot that we are so prone to. Unfortunately, there has not been a ton of progress when it comes to that. The other product that comes up is more of a do I want it or do I not, would be Heads Up. That's something that's been around for a number of years now. That's a biological, looking to primarily look at white mold, but they also have some other claims about some other diseases. We've trialed that for quite a few years too, looking at different varieties, multiple locations. It seems about 20% of the time it does do something. It's been a really tough thing to drill down on, when, why, and how. But occasionally there has been a significant yield, increase due to that use. So then it becomes an economic decision again, right? Depending on your cost per unit across acres and years, it's not something that you can expect a guaranteed, return on that investment this year. But is it something that's worth considering, for long term? That's a different equation for everybody.
Hmm. Well, thanks for that. And good to know that that's all being tested and looked at and something that you can talk to producers about and weighing your options of products. So I'm
Certainly.
going to open it up to other specialists and Lyndon, I saw that you put down some information from the irrigation group if they have any updates. So, Lyndon, do you want to share out what you put in the chat here?
Yeah, for those irrigators that are out there, um, there's a lot of water going on potatoes already. A lot of hay that came off last week that's getting watered for the first time. And then our small grains and wheat, the fourth wheat week, that a lot of the small grains didn't get as much water from rainfall as they would have liked. So irrigation could probably kick in. For those that are just starting their systems, there's an article up there about inspection and repair. And then there's an article from Dr. Dong and a website that Angie's put together that talks about recommendations for how much water your crop would be using. Give us a call if you have irrigation questions.
Great, thanks, Lyndon. Any other specialists or folks around the state that have updates?
Good morning, Christine. This is Marty.
Hi, Marty.
Just for wheat, just check the Fusarium head scab risk model. Previously, we were showing low risk across the entire state. Now I can see on the eastern side of the thumb that there is elevated risk for a head scab. Probably not quite at flowering there. I know we're just starting to flower here on campus. So that'd just be something to watch. Foliar disease-wise, things have been pretty quiet. Powdery mildew around the state. Stripe rust. Madeline found some just the other day. So, with that fungicide timed for head scab, we will get some protection of the flag leaf as well. So maybe something to consider. And I'll pop that link in the chat here.
All right, I'm going to go back to the questions. So with a cooler midway May, is the best way to determine it's time for dry beans planting to monitor soil temperatures closely? Are there any other metrics to guide this decision, Scott, that you would recommend keeping an eye on in addition to those soil temperatures?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's where to me dry bean production gets really tricky, right? We primarily I watch those soil temperatures, and I kind of use that threshold for 65 degrees and rising. Um, that's where it gets tricky, is you have to kind of look forward, at those trends, and hope that you have the right window. Typically, to me, that window looks like 5 to 7 days of warm, dry weather. In that time, in a week like we have coming up, we would expect those beans to be emerged. The worst thing that can happen for a dry bean stand is that we plant them and we get a big heavy thunderstorm immediately after planting. If those beans have not imbibed water content yet, they have a very low oil content compared to like soybeans. So they'll actually rot before they even germinate in the ground. If they have too much water too quickly, and then if we especially get into soil crusting conditions where you have that crust on top that does not allow them to emerge, then we can start out with either a really thin stand, a really stressed stand. It's just a really difficult start to the season. So it's always the best situation we can have where we have warm soils, we have dry weather coming up, we plant those beans, and we can see them before the end of the week, and then everybody feels good. Things can obviously change, but that's by far the best recipe we can have.
Right.
And Christine, if I could follow up on Scott's comments, and I should have mentioned this in the weather discussion, but it follows directly from what Scott's advised. Looking at soil temperatures here for much of the state right now, we're right at or just below the threshold Scott was talking about at that 65 Fahrenheit. So even some upper 50s, but a lot of low 60s. But given the forecast, given the outlook, and depending on how much rain comes over the next 24 hours, we're very likely going to go. We have that not only the 65, the mid 60s for our mean temperatures, but it will be on a rising trend next week. So the forecast, at least the weather forecast, certainly would tend to push one in that direction. So again, another reason that look at this as an opportunity, hopefully.
All right. Well, fingers crossed, Jeff, here. It looks like next week's going to be good for dry beans. All right. So David asked any information about the planted early dry bean plots this year? What dates were you able to get those in, and what were the results from last year's early planted dry beans?
Yeah, so the kind of standing plan we've had, is to plant once a week starting the first week of May. So really, we want to see the shoulders of that window, right? Because typically, dry beans are seeded after Memorial Day. So really, we're trying to push as early as we could possibly push it, and understanding that some of those early dates may be too early. This year, with just the rain that we had, we weren't going to plant those beans when things were truly unfit. So our first one was May 12th, and that's where we kind of mentioned that was when we were in that first warming pattern where we actually had warm soils for quite a few days there. And then we planted again on the 16th, as we went more into that, cooling trough of soil temps. And then we weren't able to plant again until the 27th. Just the nature of the year that we have here. And we understand that when you put those trials out, you can have the best plan, but, when reliant on the weather and field conditions, you've got to pivot as you go. Last year, was the first year that we did that. We got more planting dates in last year, but we got, pounded with multiple 2-inch plus rainfalls. So it really hurt those stands. Um, Overall, significant results out of that trial last year that we looked at, because we looked at planting date and also varieties. Planting date, there was no significant difference, between any of those planting dates, with the exception of one where we got almost 2 inches of rain within 30 minutes of planting the trial. Most dry bean growers would say, yep, you would kind of expect that to be a poor situation, based on, what we've discussed so far. But where we did have a significant difference is the black bean variety Blackbeard was significantly better than all varieties tested in that trial, which it was a really rough trial, given those weather conditions and planting conditions that we had, which kind of speaks to something I think we've been seeing over the past few years, that when things are rough and beans are not quite what you want them to be, typically that variety has been a little more resilient. And I think it's maintaining a little bit more root health. It's a little more tolerant to some of that root disease that we have, and has some good root structure to it. So I think that is something that we learned out of last year's trial. And hopefully this year things aren't quite as rough, but it'll be interesting to see, what those results do turn out like. And we will have that as a stop, on our field day here in the third week of August.
Great. And we'll share out information more on that once we get a bit closer. That'll be exciting to see. Hey, another question for you here, Scott. Um, I think that generally looking at the trends from the past trials here, so you mentioned this early plant, it really depends on the variety, but what else in terms of disease differential from a difference with planted now or, early into June yields? Is it, worth the risk for some of these varieties if you're able to get it in earlier based on that? Is the one black beard variety really the only one standing out, or are there others?
And that's where it's a really good research question, right? If you kind of go to anecdotal knowledge, right? Later planted beans historically were better. But historically, they could struggle with mold a little more, right? As you push that flowering period later into the summer, later into early mid-August, where we get those, morning dews, we get foggy, typically here in the thumb, which is always thought of a good thing, right? That dry beans typically perform and fill pods really well when we have those cool nights, and we take that stress off of them. So if we push planting dates earlier, we're pushing earlier into the summer, where anecdotally we have more plant stress. Could that negatively impact yields? Yes. Could that positively impact disease development? Potentially, right? These are a lot of questions that we don't have answers to yet. And it also brings up questions like weed control. So Christy Spriggs, working on this topic too, of, we're really reliant on a lot of our, PPIs and pre-emergent herbicides. So if we move those applications up close to a month earlier in the season, and we're managing that much higher of a weed flush with the same chemistry, where is that system going to break down? So there are a lot of questions of, well, why would you do this? And to me, there's multiple advantages, right? One, long term, you can look at this from a breeder's perspective, that if we add longer a longer season, more of what is acceptable for a grower to raise based on maturity, we can push those maturity groups longer. And with maturity generally comes yield. So if we can plant a week earlier, and still harvest at the same time, with longer maturity beans, that's a great avenue. Also, generally harvest conditions are better earlier in the fall than later. If we're talking about color, if we're talking about quality. When we get into, October, November, harvesting dry beans, generally it's not nearly as nice as it is in September.
Great. Thanks for that. All right, to you, Jeff. Will we be will we be seeing these southwest winds associated with warmer temperatures? And there's going to be a lot of forages cut in next week for dry hay, Phil mentioned. So good to know what kind of
Right.
winds temps we're expecting.
Well, southwest winds, yes, the direction, but there's nothing that shows up as being a consistent, really a high wind type of thing. Most days here, especially we look into the weekend, the latter part of the weekend, and into next week when the temperatures do go above 80 again, we'll see probably daytime winds 10, maybe 15 miles per hour, and they will be southerly or southwesterly probably by then, but nothing really extended. The other thing I would say too, especially about forage and cutting hay, we should see strong sunshine, and this is the strongest sun we get all year, and that's gonna hopefully move things along pretty quickly. So keep an eye on things, and even though we won't be seeing the really strong winds here or looking for that, there will be really, I think, pretty high drying rates and curing rates as we move into next week.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. And then one last question, and we'll close it out from Clay here. Any trials with planting after fall rye cover crops like with soybeans?
Yeah, and that's a great question and something we've worked on over the years, right? Both stale seeding, trying to figure that system out, right? And how could dry beans work into that? So yes, we are coming at it again, working with Christy Sprague and her current PhD student, primarily looking at tillage methods after cover crop termination into both oats. Seeded in the spring and rye seeded in the fall. Looking at conventional tillage, no-till, and strip tillage into those. So that's where I'm really excited about. We have not looked at the strip tillage aspect of it before, and I think it has a lot of potential there, but also a lot of really good questions too about, pre-emergent herbicides, PPIs. How does that system work, or how could it potentially work for us? So a lot of fun stuff.
Great. We look forward to hearing about that when you're back again to share. But until next week, we hope that you guys are doing well. We'll close it out for now. Have a good day.